Hi everyone, and welcome to the webinar on farm use of precision dairy data. My name is Christine Picard, and I'll be your host today. I'm also the founder of Cow Coach, a consultancy that provides independent advice to dairy farmers on the topic of automatic milking and dairy sensors. We want to help farmers improve their overall herd health and help them make the right choices for their farm. Today's session is part of a larger webinar series focusing on the different challenges that dairy farmers with automatic milking systems face. Previous sessions were dedicated to different topics, such as the combination of automatic milking and grazing, claw health, and labor efficiency in AMS barns. And those sessions can be watched again through the Cow Coach website. In today's webinar, which is the final part of the series, we will address the practical use of data generated by precision dairy sensors, such as electronic activity meters or rumination sensors. The adoption of these technologies is becoming more and more common, seeing that they have the potential to improve herd health and productivity, and also reduce the need for physical labor. Some of these technologies have been around for years. So now is a good time to ask ourselves, where do we stand now? What has changed over these last years, and what will change in the coming years? And our guest speaker of today, whom I will be introducing shortly, will definitely shed a light on that. But before we start, I would like to go over some of the practicalities. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available after the session has ended. Everyone who registered will automatically receive an email with a link to the recording. And also on the right side of the screen, you can see a chat window. If you have any questions or remarks during the webinar, feel free to type it in there. We'll try to answer all of your questions at the end of the webinar. And if you have a question but you don't exactly know how to say it in English, don't worry about it, that's fine. Just say it in Dutch and I will try to translate it. Anyway, having said all this, it's time to introduce our guest speaker, who is joining us all the way from the United States. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Bewley, Dairy Analytics and Innovation Scientist with Holstein Association USA and Adjunct Professor of Animal Science at Western Kentucky University. Dr. Bewley has been on the forefront of precision dairy research for over a decade. His PhD work at Purdue University focused on the application and the economics of precision dairy farming technologies. And since then, he has published over 50 scientific peer-reviewed articles. He's an active member of the American Dairy Science Association and the National Mastitis Council. Dr. Bewley can offer us a unique perspective on the latest development in the field of dairy sensors. So welcome again, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Bewley. I give the floor to you now.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for the invitation to come present to you today, and looking forward to some good questions here at the end on a topic that I find very interesting and exciting. As Christine mentioned, I've been working in this area for about 15 years now and have direct experience with many different technologies, sensor technologies, all kinds of technologies. And I'd like to share with you today some of my experiences and thoughts on how we actually consider what we should do with these technologies and how we make them work in the field. As you mentioned, I'm with the Holstein Association USA. I really think that when we look at our dairy industry, it's amazing the scientific breakthroughs that we've made in areas like nutrition, genetics, reproduction, cow comfort, physiology, and health. But the next big scientific breakthrough is in analytics. It's how we use data on our dairy farms. And it's really just an extension of what's happened in the rest of our lives. The world through Google and Facebook and Amazon and so forth has changed dramatically over the last decade. And we're seeing that in the dairy industry also. It's really amazing to me when we look across the landscape at what kinds of companies are involved in this livestock technology and analytics revolution. Of course, we see many names on the slide here that we're very familiar with, that have been very active in the dairy industry for many, many years. But we also see a number of younger companies, of startup companies that are involved in this arena. And we're going to continue to see this. We're going to continue to see more players involved in this because of the massive opportunity that sits in front of us for livestock technology and analytics. The area that we're going to spend most of our time talking about today is what I call precision dairy monitoring. Precision dairy monitoring is when we are monitoring some variable. We may be looking at something in the milk. We might be looking at something physiological or something behavioral or something with the conformation of the animal. And in general, what we're doing is we're measuring the same variable continuously across time. And we're looking for a deviation from the norm. We're looking at a management by exception approach. So the easiest thing to think about is with activity. If we have activity, then we're looking for a change in activity, for example, when the cow's in heat, when it's time to breed that animal, because that cow's going to deviate by quite a bit from her natural average or baseline for activity. That's the basic concept and basic application of precision dairy monitoring. So when I look at the cow, I think, what kinds of stories does that cow tell me? And I like to watch cows. I'm a cow behavior background and have been watching cows since I was a little kid. And I think that cows can tell us a lot of stories if we're watching them. But these technologies provide us the opportunity for them to tell us even more stories. And there are things that we measure with technologies that, of course, we have always looked at or always measured in some way or another. And then there are things that we know we should be looking at, but maybe we didn't necessarily measure. And then there are items that we maybe measure with a technology that we couldn't measure without the technology. And there are dozens and dozens of examples of things that we could measure. Now, I think that one of the practical questions is, if I can measure these, should I measure them? And it doesn't take an economist to figure out that if I look at all the items on that list, I probably can't afford technologies to monitor everything on this list. So the economics become very important. Also, just because I can measure something doesn't mean that I should. And we need to think about whether or not I can take that piece of information and turn it into a meaningful action or a meaningful decision on the farm. And this is where we really have to do some common sense thinking about how we use the data on farm. There are many different precision dairy monitoring applications. Estrus detection, I think, is the most mature application. We've had technologies that do this for 15 to 20 years. These estrus detection technologies work very well. And it was the easy one because there is such a dramatic change in activity that occurs when a cow is in heat. And generally speaking, it goes from not in heat to in heat and very quickly returns back to normal. When we get into some of these other applications, it does become a bit more complex because we have gradual changes across time, much more noise in the data set. But that being said, probably even more potential for things like mastitis detection or fresh cow disease detection, lameness detection, calving detection. I think one of the neat things that comes out of this data is that it provides us with new phenotypic information that we can use to develop new genetic evaluations. And then not only can we use this data for looking at individual animals, but we can use it for management monitoring. So we can look at these variables either by the group level or pen level or the farm level to be able to identify changes in management that maybe affect every cow in the herd. It's really overwhelming, I think, sometimes how many different technologies have become available to us. And you look at the slide here, you see a lot of examples of technologies. And I kind of divide these technologies into three areas. The wearables, these are the devices that we attach to the animal. The image-based devices or machine vision-based devices, and then milk analyses. And we're continuing to see more and more of these types of technologies on our farms. So this is an example of an ad from Dairy Master, a company out of Ireland that you're probably familiar with, of what all we can tell from just having a neck tag on an animal. We can tell a lot of information about that cow for her estrus cycle, reproductive status, and of course about her health. And it's really neat to see the commonality between what's happened in the wearable technology industry for people and for cows. Really, in many cases, we're just taking the same ideas and we're borrowing those ideas from the human industry and bringing them to the dairy industry. So I think it made my life a lot easier when the Fitbit came out, because I could describe to people what I do as I work with Fitbits for cows. And that's really what we're doing. We're taking an accelerometer-based technology and using that to monitor various behaviors on the animal. And there are dozens and dozens of examples of wearables that we're borrowing the idea from the human industry and bringing it into the animal industry. One of the things that I think is interesting, though, is that we buy all these devices maybe for ourselves, and we don't necessarily question, at least from a scientific perspective, how accurate they are. And we maybe have a little bit higher standard sometimes for cows than what we do for ourselves. So let's just kind of walk around this cow here. You can see a number of different devices that we may look at for the animal, starting up here with the ear. So this is a device that sits the ear. It measures things like rumination behavior, feeding behavior, overall activity, and this one is actually also a real-time location system. We also have net-based devices that measure those same variables. We have devices that sit in the rumen or the reticulum to measure things like temperature and pH. We have a number of image-based devices now to look at things like body condition score. This is a pressure-based device for heat detection, a tail-based device for calving detection, leg-based device for monitoring line behavior and number of steps, and then milk devices for monitoring things like fat, protein, lactose, and somatic cell count. Now, sometimes I think we maybe think about this as almost science fiction, because it really seems crazy. You know, when I first heard about the idea that we could use an accelerometer and measure something like rumination behavior, eating behavior, I really thought that's not possible. There's no way that we can do that. That's science fiction. And in reality, if you watch a cow ruminate, you'll see that it's a very consistent motion that her head and her ear makes. And that's how we're able to pick up that motion with something called an accelerometer. Really pretty simple concept. An accelerometer has been used so widely in the cell phone industry and other industries that we're able to borrow what realistically is a very cheap technology and bring it into the dairy animal. It's important to think about, though, that although these technologies definitely can, and I've been involved in studies where we have physically watched the cows ruminate or watched the cows eat, and we do a validation to ensure that the technology really does do what it says it's doing. And some of these technologies are really, really good at monitoring these behaviors. However, not all of them are. And I think we assume sometimes that just because one technology can measure rumination behavior accurately, that all of them can. And in reality, that's not the case. Some of these technologies are not that good at measuring what they report to measure. I think the metabolic disease area is quite interesting. This is a nice slide out of the 4D4F group out of the United Kingdom, where they've shown what all we could monitor for metabolic disease. So we look at changes in body condition score with a camera-based system. We're looking at changes in the milk for things like BHBA, acetone, fat protein ratios, or just simply a change in milk production. Maybe we have a scale for monitoring body weight, changes in behavior, all the things we talked about with those accelerometers, changes in the rumen for rumen pH and temperature, changes in body temperature, maybe that's an ear-based device, or changes in where the animal is, so position-based device. It's also possible that we could use these technologies to monitor behaviors that we've not thought about measuring before. So we actually developed a device a few years ago to monitor sleep. in this video we're showing, you can see that this cow's in a really good deep sleep. And with this, we've noticed that cows in an open housing system spend a lot more time sleeping than cows in cubicle or freestall-based systems. So we can use an accelerometer device to measure something like this, and then we maybe move to the idea of measuring rest quality rather than just rest quantity. There are also a number of these devices that are basically real-time location systems. So it's kind of GPS for cows, where we take the device and we're monitoring the position of the cow. We oftentimes are doing this per second, so we know the exact position of each cow in the herd every second of the day. Really a tremendous amount of information, overwhelming amount of information. This can be used for identifying where an animal is. If we're going out to a pen and we're trying to find an animal, this is particularly useful in a very large farm, probably not as useful in a small farm where we really don't have to look that hard to find the cow, or maybe we even know the cows very, very individually and know where they are. But I think where it's really more interesting is if we look at changes in behavior. So we may be looking, for example, at the amount of time the cow spends at the bunk, or the amount of time she spends in the stall, the amount of time she spends lying down or staying up, the amount of time she spends at the water. And when we look at changes in that behavior to identify when something's going on with that animal. Or we could look at relationships between animals. So we could use some social network analysis to identify behavioral changes that may tell us something interesting or useful about the animal. Then I think the other piece is this provides us with the opportunity to create some cow responsive environments. Also, some neat things going on with virtual reality systems or augmented reality systems, where we can really visually see what all is going on with an animal in the air, basically with the goggles. This is really a fascinating technology, so we can do a lot of things without having the constraints of a smart device in our hands. And then virtual fences. So basically, in a pasture-based system, to have a virtual fence to move animals to rotational graze. I think it's neat also to think about how we can create cow responsive environments. So, historically, we've looked at things like when to turn fans on and when to turn sprinklers on based on outside temperature. But in reality, the cow's experience is more than just what's happening outside right now. It's what's happening over a period of time. And so with these technologies, we have the ability to monitor something like core body temperature and use the body temperature in a feedback loop to be able to know when to turn the fans on and the sprinklers on. I think that really could help us be more responsive to the cow's needs. Or maybe this tells us that the fan should be on in part of the barn, or the sprinkler should be on in part of the barn rather than in the entire barn. And that's really an example here of a neat, simple technology. But this is a monitoring device from a startup company here in the US, where they have a sensor on the feed bunk to turn the sprinkler system on by section based on whether or not there's cows at that section. Too often I see the sprinkler systems on when there's no cows, either at the whole bunk or in sections of the bunk. So it's a very simple sensor system that we could use to be responsive to the cow's needs. We spent a lot of time talking about wearable technologies, but what should we look for in a wearable technology? So here's the things that I'd like to look for. First of all, I want something that's easy to attach to the cow. I want it to stay on the cow without creating injuries or abrasions. I'd like a battery life of at least 3 to 5 years. I'd like for data to be transmitted without interruption, that it stores enough data to withstand a system failure. What I mean by that is sometimes the electricity goes off or something like that. And I'd like for it to be able to continue to collect data. And then when the system comes back on, it transmits the data that it's been collecting in the meantime. And I'd really like to see less than 2% of the devices fail per year. I don't think it's realistic to say that 0 devices fail. It's a very difficult environment to make these devices work in, but I see a wide variation in device failure rate. And I don't think that people ask this question enough. If we see 25, 30, or even 50% of the devices fail in a year, and believe me, we've seen that, that's really not practical for a dairy farmer or economical. 2% I think we can work with. So a really important question to ask as we look at wearable technologies. What percentage of the devices fail per year? I get the question a lot of times about where's the best place to put a tag. And I don't think that there is a real answer to this question. I think that there are pros and cons to every location, and to a large degree, this comes down to personal preference. Which of the pros and cons do you want to work with in your situation? The ear is pretty easy to put the device on, and it's a small device. That's kind of nice. However, the challenge with an ear-based device is that it can be easily caught and torn out. The leg, it stays on quite well. However, it's a bit harder to put on. It may collect some manure, and maybe we don't get quite as much information with the leg tag. So the leg tags were early. The lying time information from a cow comfort perspective, really interesting. But sometimes I think if I have a choice between getting that versus getting some of the eating and rumination behavior off of the ear tag or the neck tag, then perhaps I lean toward the ear or neck tags just because I get that information. So nothing specifically about the tag itself, but really just more about the information that we get from that physical location. The neck is a great location for behavior. It stays on quite well. However, there are some issues that we have to think about with regard to neck growth. So the cow, as you know, we put this on a fresh 2-year-old, that animal's going to grow during that lactation. Or if we have an animal that loses a lot of body condition score, gains a lot of body condition score, we need to adjust that strap. And so that's an issue that we have to think about. Manageable one, but I think it's something we can think about. The tail, good location for calving behavior. However, it's really difficult to keep that balance between whether or not we keep that device on or whether it falls off. And so if it falls off, obviously it's not very useful. However, if we put it on too tight, it may cause blood flow, and then we end up with a toxic tail. So I think there's variations, there's benefits and downsides to each of the locations as far as tag management goes. I get the question a lot of times, which one gives me the most accurate heat detection with the activity-based devices? And I can tell you that they all do a really nice job with heat detection. The location is really not a relevant question for heat detection. For some of the disease detection, though, as we mentioned, perhaps some differences to think about there. Although we've been dominated by wearable technologies in the last decade, I think the next decade will see a lot more technologies that are image-based or milk-based. And this is really going to change precision dairy monitoring, because we can do some things perhaps with these devices that we couldn't do with the wearable sensors. We have a fixed cost that we can spread across more animals, and really opens up some new opportunities in that regard. So we have companies like the Soma Detect company. It's a startup here in the US that's looking at measuring somatic cell count, measuring things like pregnancy detection, estrus detection, and of course our typical milk components within a device in line. Really neat opportunities, potentially a younger company, so more work to be done yet, but very interesting what they're proposing that they can do. Or we could look at something like image analysis for monitoring locomotion behavior. So in this video, we would see this cow walking, and we're tracking the position of each leg to be able to use this for locomotion detection. We could even take the idea of image analysis and expand that to looking at something like feed volume. So we could measure perhaps feed intake by looking at the contour feed in a feed bunk. A number of new companies now that are looking at behavior for using video. So we might be looking at feeding behavior, for example, walking behavior, all this using a camera-based system, even perhaps using facial recognition to identify which cows are which. Some neat things happening in this area also. Maybe looking at thermography. So thermography is basically looking at changes in temperature. You see some examples here of changes in temperature related to cows with clinical or subclinical mastitis. And then I think there's really neat potential for taking something like the image analysis idea and using this for genetic evaluation. So perhaps we could use a camera-based system to measure these linear traits and use that to get a more accurate depiction of the linear traits that we've typically measured subjectively. We do have to keep a balance between what we see with all this technological transformation and some of the associated challenges. I don't want to spend the rest of the time talking about how we think about that. So we do get these nice articles in the press about how cow Fitbits are telling us all this neat information about the animal, but sometimes people aren't as impressed on farm. And certainly probably you've worked with or you are a dairy producer that's experienced some of the frustrations associated with using this technology on farm. And we even see now some data showing that perhaps these technologies aren't quite what we thought they were. So just a recent publication, an article in press in the Journal of Dairy Science right now, where they said that they did some comparisons. They compared your cows that had or didn't have use of a technology, and they found that it didn't really change survival rate, milk yield, or reproductive success, even when we had the same devices on the same animals. And so then you have to question, well, what is the real value if it doesn't change these ultimate outputs? Some people say these technologies are plug and play, but maybe they're more plug and pay or plug and pray. And we go through this sort of life cycle of a technology. We have a technology trigger where we identify a new device. Then we enter this peak of inflated expectations. Perhaps we get our hopes up a little too much for what it could do. And then we enter this trough of disillusionment where we're a little frustrated maybe with what we can't do. And then we enter the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. And I would say that with estrus detection technologies, we've been through this entire cycle. We figured out what they can and can't do. For example, an estrus detection technology cannot detect a cow that's not actually in heat. That was probably something we should have known, but when technologies come, maybe we get the expectations a little too high. I think maybe even with some of the rumination eating behavior technologies, we're probably out in this area here, the slope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity. And then maybe you could argue that, although I'm pretty optimistic about the image and melt-based devices, maybe sometimes we're still in the peak of inflated expectations with those technologies. What does an ideal technology tell us? First of all, I think it needs to explain an underlying biological process. It needs to be something that can be translated into a meaningful action, cost-effective, not necessarily cheap, but it needs to be something that I can show an economic return for. It needs to be flexible, robust, and reliable, simple and solution-focused, and then the information needs to be provided to me in a readily available format. One of the basic ideas with early disease detection is that this might allow us to detect things better than what we could with just watching cows on our own. It might help us to improve the results of our intervention strategy, and it could provide us with some indication of what's something going on at a herd level faster to help us manage the overall herd, not just that individual animal. One of the most important things that I think we have to think about is how good are we at finding the events that we're interested in? It's very easy to show this kind of data. And this is from some of our data where we looked at changes in various behaviors relative to cows with or without disease. So here we see changes in line time with cows with or without subclinical ketosis. So the cows with subclinical ketosis spent more time lying down. The cows with subclinical ketosis spent less time ruminating. The cows with subclinical ketosis had a higher fat protein ratio than those without. Or the cows with milk fever spent more time lying down. The cows with metritis spent more time lying down. You see a trend here. We can really clearly show differences when we're comparing cows with and without particular conditions and show statistical significance and so forth. So from a scientific perspective, this is quite interesting. From a practical perspective, it's not the whole story. We have to ask ourselves, what about sensitivity and specificity? So sensitivity is basically our true positive rate, and specificity is our true negative rate. And we really need to evaluate these questions to determine whether or not these technologies are providing us with useful alerts. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here we have an example where we have 100 metritis events, and the technology identifies 80 of those, but it misses 20 of them. And we would call this an 80% sensitivity. We have 20 false negatives. And many would say that's probably not good enough. I wanted to catch more of those than 80%. The flip side of that question is if I have 100 metritis alerts, 90 of them are for cows that have metritis, and 10 of them are for cows that do not have metritis. We would call this a 90% specificity, that we have 10 false positives. And some people would say this isn't good enough. So in this case, we have a combination of 80% sensitivity and 90% specificity. In reality, we don't see much in the published literature indicating anything anywhere near this combination of metrics. It's easy to look at one or the other, but the problem is these two things are always fighting each other. So I can make something pick up everything and be 100% sensitive, but when I do that, I get more false positives. Or I can say it always has to be right, but in order for it to always be right, that means I'm going to miss more. And so we have to find the sweet spot or the balance between those two. And I think the reality is that varies. It varies by condition, it varies by farm, and it's really an economic question. It's what's the cost of a false positive compared to a false negative? When we think about something like estrus detection, maybe if I breed a cow that's not in heat, the cost of that is less than waiting another 21 days. So the cost of the false positive is not that high. However, if let's say I've got a cow with mastitis and I treat that animal with mastitis, the cost of the false positive is very high. So it varies much by condition that we're looking at. Here's the full story. This is that same data set where I showed you all these graphs, and we looked at sensitivity and specificity. We had 7 different systems on the same animals, and we compared using an algorithm, a similar algorithm, and you can see here our detection rates and our false positive rates were quite high in both. Probably the best combination here, this top one, with an 80% detection rate and a 15% false positive. And here's what happens in reality. So this is an example of data from 2 cows, just over 4 months each. And you can see the pink bars here represent when the system had an alert. The blue stars represent when the farmer actually did something or found something. And as we look across these 2 graphs on these 2 cows, we can see that there are times when it does what we want it to do. So the technology said something's wrong with this cow, and she actually has metritis. But there are also times when we have technologies that give us an alert, but they don't necessarily correlate to an event. And so this can become a little bit frustrating. This can be a little bit frustrating to see I don't have the matches that I'd always like to find. And in reality, in this particular study where the farmers had to record what they did with the data, we actually found that they ignored the alerts two-thirds of the time. So what happens is across time, maybe they lose a little bit of faith in the system because they are getting those false positives. In this particular study, these are the health events that they had. So there were 844 cows that were identified as having some disease, but as you can see here, there were 20-some thousand alerts provided by the system in a year. So a lot of false positives, a lot of false alerts. It's a little bit more complex than that, though. High specificity, so usually the technology was right if it gave an alert, but low sensitivity, it missed quite a bit. We were able to get a better accuracy of an alert by looking at a wider window. So that's one way we can make the technology perhaps look better, is if we say, if it identified a cow within 3 weeks or 6 months or something like that, then it can look better. We probably don't want to go too liberal, but we don't want to go too strict there either. Because if we have a technology that tells us exactly when we identified that the cow was sick, then it probably didn't really help us that much. So really, if we're defining these things like sensitivity and specificity, how we define that window of time that we're comparing to is really important. One of the neat things, though, is that when we applied some machine learning techniques, machine learning is a fancy word that applies to basically newer statistical techniques, we were able to improve the sensitivity and specificity, so forth. And more companies now are applying machine learning techniques into how they use this data. And I think we're seeing improved results from using these types of statistical analyses in addition to the traditional approaches. There are some challenges, though, that we have to think about when we look at this kind of data. And here's just some examples of what may happen. Sometimes the technology is alerting us to a subclinical condition that really is an issue, but the farmer doesn't think it's an issue because it's subclinical, and so they view that as a false positive. Sometimes the system provides an alert sooner than physical signs may appear. So the system says something's wrong with this cow. I go look at her. What do I do if she physically looks okay? And then sometimes the system provides us with alerts after we've observed clinical symptoms, and in that case, it probably didn't help us much at all. I do think we can solve some of this with something like a health index. It's probably not really fair to define a disease as a 0-1. Disease is a continuum. We really should think about it more as she's a little bit sick or a lot sick, rather than just she's healthy or sick. And so when we define this in some kind of risk, like we see in the chart here, based on a color-based indication, this can help us to deal with this sensitivity and specificity issue that we talked about. I think it's really important that we have to think about how we handle the data. What's our protocol for handling alerts on farm? What do we do about natural reactions of healthy cows? If I'm measuring somatic cell count every milking for every cow in the herd, I'm going to have animals that increase in somatic cell count for a couple of milkings, and they're perfectly okay. Their body deals with the infection and moves on. We have to think about changing our paradigm or changing the way we think about things if we have this new kind of data, because otherwise we run the risk of really over treating animals. How do we handle repeat alerts? What do we do about animals that we see the alert over and over and over again? What do we do about failed devices? How do we detect those and replace the devices? What's our backup plan for a system outage? So if the system's out for a couple of days, what's our plan for doing heat detection? And then how do we consider things like data ownership and data security? What should I look for in a software interface? I'd like to see a cloud-based interface, a smartphone application, a device or a software interface that addresses the needs of both visual and verbal learners. We all see the world a little bit differently. An intuitive user interface, interconnectivity with herd management software. That's one of the challenges that we deal with in many cases. A real-time data display, customer-focused training and support, really huge. People ask me a lot of times, what's the best technology? And I say, it's whoever you think you can get the best customer support from. And that tends to be a very local question. The customer support is really, really huge. And I want to see a refined alert list. I don't expect that the technology's alerts are always right, but I want to see that if I have 1,000 cows, I don't have 500 cows show up on that alert list every day. There are challenges and limitations that we have to think about. First of all, we do have brand differences in measures. We'll get into that in a little bit. The technologies do fail sometimes, and we have to think about standardization, calibration, and integration of the data. We need to remember that we need third-party validations. It's really commonplace in feed additives, for example, that we have validations to say that this feed additive really does what it says it's going to do. We need to have that same expectations of our technologies. Does it really measure what it says it's measuring? And I can tell you from personal experiences, some of these technologies are excellent and some of them are not so good at measuring what they say that they're measuring. And here's really an interesting, surprising result that came from a study. We had multiple devices on the same animals, and you can see here 3 different devices that measure rumination time. And on average, there was over 100 minutes a day difference in rumination time. 4 different devices that measure line time, and on average, there was over 3 hours a day difference in line time. And then 3 different technologies that measured number of steps, and on average, over 2,000 steps different. So massive differences, same cows, big differences. Which ones are measuring this correctly, and which ones are measuring it incorrectly? It's hard to say if we don't have those third-party validations. The other thing was, this was the same study where we wanted to combine all these variables from different technologies into one sort of super algorithm. And we found in the end we couldn't do it because the devices were randomly failing at such a high rate. So only 29% of the time were all the devices measuring at the same time. If it's 80%, then 80% times 80% times 80% leads us to this kind of a result. Although we spend a lot of our time talking about individual animal data, I think we need to also think about how we can use this data at the group level or the cow level. Really, the group level data, farm level data, is most useful for within group or within herd changes. We have to be really, really cautious in using this data to compare farms. I hear people say a lot of times, I'm looking at a rumination level of 450 minutes or 550 minutes or whatever, and that's a sign that rumen health is good in this particular herd. I think we can say it's good for that particular herd, or better now than it was for that particular herd. But we have to be really careful for comparing across farms, because as we saw on that other slide, it depends on which technology they have. We could have 100 minutes a day difference in rumination behavior that tells us nothing about rumen behavior. It's just that one farm has one technology and another farm has a different technology. Another thing I think is important to think about is that sometimes I think we get a little too focused on disease detection and forget about disease prevention. We need to remember that disease prevention is always more effective than disease detection. And we lean toward that discussion a little bit too much in some of this technology discussion. We also have to think about data silos. I see a lot of this where we have data sitting in all these different silos and it doesn't really connect that well to each other. And we need better integration of data. This is not an easy task though. This is not really simple. I used to think it was simple. It's actually quite complex. The good news though is that there are multiple companies now that are really developing platforms for helping us to look at how we integrate this data together. We need to remember that there's huge within cow and within herd variation in some of these variables. Management factors, environmental conditions affect the variables. So if we have a rainstorm, if it's a windy day, all those things can cause some big changes. Anytime we move an animal from one group or pen to another, we're going to see some massive differences. Some cows, they simply don't read the book. They don't they don't do what we thought that they were supposed to do. And not all changes are linear. So, if I'm getting a cow that she's starting to get mastitis, does she lay down more or less? And reality is some lay down more, some lay down less. The other thing is that mastitis isn't mastitis, right? We have different causes of mastitis, different bacteriological causes of mastitis, and those different causes may result in a different behavioral reaction. This is my friend David Corbin, a dairy farmer here in Kentucky. David taught me a lot about technologies. When we first started him on a study a few years ago, the company said, this guy will never figure out technologies. He doesn't understand computers. In reality, he's really now a super user of technology because he understands cows. He's a good manager. He really understands cow behavior. Good managers, good cow people are the ones that are going to get the most value out of this data, not those looking for a simple solution for a magic bullet of improving their management. Mistakes happen. We are going to have challenges and mistakes with these technologies. We should expect that. We've learned, for example, that Cat5 cable, raccoons here really love to eat Cat5 cable, and that's a practical reality that we have to think about. Lightning will strike the same technology more than once. And there's another practical reality that we have to think about. As I mentioned earlier, customer service is really important. I think it's more important than the actual technology itself. We don't always have the highest level of computer literacy. I'm amazed sometimes I've spent my life with computers, but how much I don't know about computers sometimes. We're not necessarily engineers. We have a limited amount of time we can spend on this. And then sometimes the hardware and the software both, they fail. They don't work as well as we wanted them to. How can we as advisors help our dairy clientele? I think we can, first of all, help people understand the pros and cons of different systems. We can help them understand the investment economics. We really don't talk about this a lot today, but the economics of when to or whether or not to invest in these technologies is really, really important. They have to be economical. We can help people create a plan for using the data. How do you determine what to do with a particular animal with an alert? And develop the protocols that we need for therapeutics, treatment, and culling using the data provided by these systems. Here's some questions that I think producers should ask, particularly with regard to wearable technologies. First of all, what's the sensitivity and specificity for whatever we're looking for? So how good are you at picking up the cow that's in heat, a cow that's sick? What percentage of the devices fail in a year? What's the warranty policy? What's the policy for upgrading to new versions of devices? And make sure we capture the full cost. There aren't any hidden costs there. I want to know what the cost of the hardware, the devices, maintenance, data storage, all of that in the whole package. And then what protocols do you have for helping me know what to do with the alert? I think so often people give somebody a system and they say, now you're going to know that you have this alert, but what do I do about that alert? And I think many times the manufacturer of the technologies have a really good idea of what to do with that alert because they've worked with dozens of other farmers in that. And although I spend quite a bit of time here talking about some of the potential pitfalls and concerns to think about, one of the things I think we have to remember is that perfection is the enemy of progress. Sometimes maybe we hold the bar a little too high in what we expect out of these technologies and forget that it's way better than what we were doing before. So even when we get into some of these technologies, say for fresh cow disease detection, where we may be concerned about the high false positive rate, maybe it's still better than going out and looking and evaluating every cow. Even if I have 10% or 20% false positives, that's better than going and looking at every single animal and doing an evaluation of every single animal. So it still can be quite useful even when it's not perfect. Where do we go from here? Well, I think first of all, we need to recognize that disease is a spectrum. It's not a 0-1 scenario. Machine learning is going to help us a lot in this. These new techniques are really going to help us. Now, it's not magic. We need to feed it back data. We need to tell it when the cow's actually sick, for example. But machine learning can be really beneficial. We need to better use this information to determine what's the right course of action. We need flowcharts of what we're going to do. So should I treat this animal? Should I culture her? Should I use some kind of therapeutic intervention to help her from ever becoming sick? That course of action is not always clear, and probably the biggest area where veterinarians in particular can help. And we need to recognize that there are more benefits to these technologies than just what we learn at the cow level, but also what we learn at the herd level. And lastly, I know I mentioned it a few times, but we really need to assess the economic benefit of these technologies. And what's the economic benefit of identifying a cow that's sick perhaps a week sooner than what we would have without the technology? So thank you guys for your time today. My contact information is there. There is a typo on there. My email is jbewley@holstein.com, not CPOM. So thanks for your attention, and hopefully we have a few questions here, and look forward to additional discussion.
Thank you very much for that engaging presentation, Dr. Bewley. We do have some questions. I'll start with a question from Ron. In one of the slides, you mentioned a couple of questions that dairy farmers should ask technology producers before they purchase the system, right? And Ron would like to ask add another important question: who owns the data? What's your take on data ownership? I know there are some initiatives in the Netherlands and here in Belgium as well to define data ownership and make transparent sharing of data possible. What in the US? What's happening in the US?
Great question. It is a good question for dairy producers to be asking. Unfortunately, I don't think it's on the dairy farmer's mind as much as it is some of the rest of us, but it should be, because it's an important question. And one of the challenges is that it's the same thing as if when I install an app on my phone, I have an end user license agreement for every app that you install, and it's really long, and you usually don't want to read it, so you just collect and you say yes. And in reality, in most cases, you've signed away that data by doing that. So legally, you've given away the data, and so there's many apps, for example, on our phones that somebody else owns the data about our usage in that app. And I think I know that's what's happening with many of the technologies also, is that you've gone through the process, you're going to use this technology, and somebody hands you a 3-page document or a 10-page document, and you sign it, and you don't realize that you've signed away the ownership of the data. It's overwhelming. I don't understand legal jargon very well, so I even if I read it, I probably wouldn't understand it in many cases. But I think we need to be asking this question more and recognize that there is an ownership that has to be thought of, and there's a value to that data. It's a tough question, and it's a legal question, really. It's not an ethical question, and it's not a science question. It's a legal question. In my personal opinion, is that the farmer should own the data, but I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't sign that paper, so really my personal opinion isn't terribly relevant. We've got to be really careful about this, because some of that data could perhaps even be used in the wrong way. So one of my concerns, for example, let's say I buy a lameness detection technology because I want to improve my lameness. But then when I know I have a lameness problem and I buy a technology that confirms that, and it says I have 30% of my cows are lame, and then that gets into somebody's hands and sends off an alert. This farm is really doing a bad job, but maybe that farm was doing the right thing by trying to improve the lameness of their herd. And when I talked about the integration of the data, this is one of the issues that comes, is that the integrator then maybe wants an ownership piece of that data. And that's why sometimes it's easy to think about the idea that we have this system that merges all of our data, but it's really hard to implement because you have all these ownership pieces and somebody wants a financial piece of that pie in the process. Software development doesn't occur for free. So I think it's unrealistic to say that there's this benevolent organization somewhere out there that wants to combine data for people for free. But it adds to the complexity of the data ownership.
Definitely a difficult topic and a problem that we won't solve today, probably. So there was another question by René. They asked that they refer to the slides where you compare the performance of different systems, but they mention that there are no names on that slide. Is there? I guess this goes back to the need for third-party validations, I guess. And where can farmers go to get good objective information? A difficult question again,
question.
I know. Sorry.
Yes. No, that's a great question. And so I used to present that result with some names, but honestly, it made some people upset because maybe their system didn't look as good as another's. And I think that's because partly these technologies are difficult to compare in that type of a setting. And that data set, for example, I think that data was collected in 2016 or 2017. Is that really relevant in 2021? So that was 5 years ago. And although I think it's interesting to see that there was that difference, to show the technology names today, well, now that technology, each of those, whether it's technology 1 or technology 4, they're 4 or 5 generations further now in their technology development. So it's not comparing what your option as a farmer is today. It's comparing maybe what your option as a farmer was 4 or 5 years ago. And also, in order to make a reasonable comparison, we used our own algorithm there. So we used the same, let's say, I don't remember if this was specific, but let's say we said +3 standard deviations from the mean for a cow that was in heat. And that's not necessarily the one that the company uses. So it has to do a lot with change across time and difficulty there. I think there's a need more for the third-party validations just to make sure that they are looking, does it measure what it say it's measuring? And perhaps we should look at each technology. Let's say we're looking at how good a technology is for mastitis detection, then we should look for the data for that particular technology where somebody was really focused on that technology. Then we are comparing technology 1 to technology 2 to technology 3. And really, although I agree with the farmer perspective, I'd really love to have that, like which system's the best. But we have the same issue in every facet of our industry. So if I want to say, what's the best source of organic copper to feed my cows? There's no study out there that says that technology A's copper is better than technology B, which is better than technology C. Or if I want to say, which is the best dry cow treatment, there's not good data for that either. Those are really difficult studies to try to actually accomplish.
Okay, thanks for that perspective. There are a couple of more questions from Zinke. She says, I can imagine some technologies are financially more interesting in big herds, like in American herds herds versus Belgian herds with an average of 70 cows. What would you advise as a good starting device in smaller herds to get familiar with this kind of new technology?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I think that all size farms can benefit from technology and data. And it sounds like this person believes that too. But I think that sometimes I get the question that this only matters for big farms. It doesn't matter for small farms. Data can really help small farms a lot. I think there are some differences. So for example, a calving detection technology might be really useful for a small farm where the person is doing multiple jobs. But on a 5,000 cow dairy, they have somebody sitting there all the time anyway. So maybe calving detection is not as useful for a large farm. The wearable technologies, they're probably a little bit more small farm friendly. So when we have these rumination devices, I think they work great on a 70 cow herd, on a 300 cow herd, but it's really hard to do that with 10,000 cows. They're not very scalable in that regard. So that would be the thing I would say for a smaller herd. The wearable devices would probably work a little bit better. Also, the cows a little bit better to interpret what's coming out of those. And maybe with some of the milk-based devices, for example, that are coming along, where we put something in a parlor and we can spread that over a few thousand cows, that makes more sense. The other thing I would say is that sometimes I think people think that all American herds are big. And certainly we have a lot of big farms, but we have a lot of small farms too. The average herd size in Kentucky, for example, is right about 90 cows.
Oh, okay.
So
smaller than I imagined. Yeah.
Yes, we do have both. We have both, and there are a lot of big farms here too. Don't get me wrong, but I see it in both settings, both small and large settings.
All right. Then there's a question from Remco. Especially in the beginning of your presentation, you showed a lot of monitoring technologies that Remco didn't know. So he's wondering, is the US more developed in data-driven farming than Europe?
No, I think in fact probably the opposite. I show some things there at the beginning to show what's possible, and have probably some of the newer technologies that are on there. I follow this area pretty closely, but I think in general, I think Europe and Israel are probably further advanced than the United States in the technology area. And part of that, I think, is because of some of the differences in labor costs. We have, in general, historically, have had a much cheaper source of labor here. And some of it probably has to do with the economics of our production system, making investments kind of difficult at times. And then I do think, like I said, on the wearable sensors, for example, that they're not particularly scalable. So it's harder for a 10,000 cow dairy to do some of those things.
Mm-hmm. All right. And maybe one more question to conclude. So you mentioned you had some advice for dairy farmers looking to purchase a sensor system, what kind of questions that they should ask. Now the other way around, do you have some advice for technology producers who want to develop a new monitoring system?
I've worked with a lot of companies over the years and some wonderful, wonderful experiences working with companies. One of the mistakes that I see sometimes, particularly startup companies, make is not having people on the team that have actually worked with cows. You need to have somebody that was from a farm or is a veterinarian or somebody that spent some of their career advising dairy producers, because there's some really practical things that I see people just make some massive mistakes on by not understanding the system in which they're working in. This is not a problem for the large companies. They have plenty of those people, but it's the startup companies that probably struggle with that more, is that they're not very grounded because they don't have somebody bringing it back to reality of saying, that the cow's going to have manure on the technology sometimes, and that's a real practical challenge that we have to think about. So that would be the biggest advice.
All right, that sounds good. So anyway, I guess that about wraps it up. Dr. Bewley, I would like to thank you again for your very engaging presentation, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day, especially considering the time difference and all. And I would also like to thank the audience at home, of course, for watching. And this has been the last session of our webinar series, focusing on the different challenges for dairy farmers with robotic milking systems. And I would love to hear what the people at home think, so that we can improve our future webinars and our services. So what kind of topic would you like to address next time? Do you know a good speaker, or maybe you are a good speaker and you would like to work together? Let me know by clicking in the link in the chat window. And if you don't have time to give your feedback right now, that's okay. We'll send a follow-up email anyway. So thank you once again. I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. And for now, stay warm, everyone, and we will see you next time around. Bye-bye. And thank you, Jeffrey, for the presentation as well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.